Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Today we'll be doing a selected reading from China and Socialism. We'll be doing the intro, and it's by Martin Hart-Landsberg and Paul Burkett. Intro. China and Socialism. During the 3 decades following the 1949 establishment of the People's Republic of China, it seemed as if these words would forever be joined in an inspiring unity. China had been forced to suffer under the humiliation of defeat in the 1840-42 Opium War with Great Britain and the ever-expanding treaty port system that followed. The Chinese people suffered under not only despotic rule by their emperor and a series of warlords, but also under the crushing weight of imperialism which divided the country into foreign-controlled spheres of influence. Gradually beginning in the 1920s, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, organized growing popular resistance to the foreign domination and exploitation of the country and the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek. The triumph of the revolution under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party finally came in 1949, but when the party proclaimed it would not bring only an end to the suffering of the people, but build a new democratic future based on the construction of socialism. It can be no doubt that the Chinese Revolution was a world historical event and that the tremendous achievements were made under the banner of socialism in the decades that followed. However, it is our opinion that reality should not blind us to 3 important facts. First time, at Mao's death in 1976, the Chinese people remained far from achieving the promises of socialism. Second, beginning in 1978, the Chinese Communist Party embarked on a market-based reform process that, while allegedly designed to reinvigorate the effort to build socialism, has actually led in the opposite direction at a great cost to the Chinese people. And finally, progressives throughout the world continue to identify and take inspiration from the developments in China, seeing the country's rapid export-led growth as either confirmation of the virtues of market socialism or proof that regardless of labels, active state direction of the economy can produce successful development within a capitalist world system. As much as we were also inspired by the Chinese Revolution, we have for some time believed that it is continuing to identification by progressives with China and its market socialist economy represents not only a serious misreading of the Chinese reform experience, but even more important, a major impediment to the development of theoretical and practical understandings required to actually advance socialism in China and elsewhere. As we will argue in this book, it is our position that China's key market reforms have not led to a socialist renewal, but rather a full-fledged capitalist restoration, including a growing foreign domination of economic domination. Significantly, this outcome is driven by a more simple greed and class interest. Once the path of pro-market reforms was embarked upon, each subsequent step in the reform process was largely driven by tensions and contradictions generated by the reforms themselves. The weakening of central planning led to ever more reliance on market and profit incentives, which in turn encountered the privileging of private enterprises over state enterprises and increasingly the foreign enterprises and markets over domestic ones. Although a correct understanding of the dynamics of China's reform process supports the Marxist position that the market socialism is an unstable formation, that is important insight has been largely lost because of the continuing widespread belief by many progressives that China remains in some sense a socialist country. This situation cannot help but generate confusion about the meaning of socialism while strengthening the ideological position of those who oppose it. Many other progressive scholars and activists dismiss arguments about the meaning of socialism as irrelevant to the challenges of development faced by people throughout the world. They look at China's record of rapid and unsustained export-led growth and conclude China is a development model with a growing strategy that can and should be emulated by other countries. We believe and argue in this book that the celebration of China is seriously a mistake, one that reflects a misunderstanding of not only the Chinese experience but also the dynamics and contradictions of capitalism as an international system. In fact, an examination of the effects of China's economic transformation on the region's other economies makes clear that the country's growth is intensifying competitive pressures and prices tendencies to the detriment of workers throughout the region, including in China. Our differences with leftists and progressives might never have produced a book about China if we were not on our own May 2003 trip to Cuba to attend an international conference on Marxism. While in the country, we sought to learn what we could about how Cuba was responding to its economic difficulties and how the government's understanding and commitment to socialism was shaping that response. We were told repeatedly that many Cuban economists looked to the Chinese market socialism growth as a strategy and attractive model for Cuba. We hoped this was not true, but at the conference itself, when discussion towards challenges facing Cuba, several Cuban economists publicly endorsed the Chinese experience of rapid export-led growth based on foreign direct investment, or FDI, as offering the only hope for Cuba to sustain its socialist project under current international conditions. Although these economists were only repeating arguments we had heard from progressives in other countries, they were especially jarring to hear at a conference concerned with the contemporary relevance of Marxism in a context where this little gain was to be imagined for economists making them. Fidel Castro was also at the conference, and the Cuban government had firmly rejected market socialism. We are certainly not the first social scientists to criticize developments in China from a Marxist perspective, but it seems clear to us that the importance of China in shaping debates about developmental and socialism has only grown. And we feel that the confusion surrounding China's post-reform experiences signifies a deeper theoretical and political confusion about Marxism and socialism that greatly hurts our collective efforts to build a world free from alienation, oppression, and exploitation. Thus, we have ventured to offer our own contribution to the study of China and socialism, focusing on our critique on the economic dynamics, social consequences, and political implications of China's reform process. Despite the fact that our work focuses on China, we hope and intend that the issues raised in consideration will also have significance for people concerned with social developments and struggles in other countries other than China. Our book begins in Chapter 1 with a discussion of the rise of China as a positive reference point for the developmental economists and explanation emphasis on the collapse of the Soviet Union and the satellite economies in the 1997-1998 Asian crisis, and the tendency of both mainstream and left economists to formulate and rationalize their national policy visions by appealing to the apparently successful development experiences of individual poster countries rather than the uneven development of accumulation and class conflict on a world scale. In Chapter 2, we critically examine the basic dynamics of China's market socialism reform progress, showing how each step in China's transition from planning to market, from domestic to export-oriented production, from state to private, increasingly foreign control, moved the system further away from any meaningful progress towards socialism in a sense of system centered on a grassroots worker community needs and capabilities. This examination also makes clear that each step was a logical outcome of not of any object requirements for future further human development, natural and social productive forces, but of the contradictions generated by previous reforms. We further show that the rapid economic growth that accompanied the reforms is largely due to factors other than efficiency gains from marketization and privatization. The arguments in this chapter undercut the widespread image of wise Chinese policymakers carefully and deliberately engineering a relatively stable, low-cost transition to a more productive, market-driven regime. In Chapter 3, we focus on the main domestic contradictions of China's reform process. We show the considerable costs of the pro-market transition, rising unemployment, economic security, inequality, intensified exploitation, declining health and education conditions, exploding government debt, and unstable prices are not transitional side effects, but rather basic preconditions of economic growth come rapid capital accumulation under Chinese conditions. We also highlight the growing, though somewhat fragmented, struggles of Chinese workers to defend the rights purportedly guaranteed to them by the pre-reform regime, and to protect themselves from the worst forms of exploitation in the new system in the face of the ongoing government repression of all independent worker and community organizing. In Chapter 4, we argue that China's economic experience cannot be fully understood in isolation from broader dynamics of global capitalism, especially uneven development and overproduction. In exploring these dynamics, we highlight how China's economic transition has benefited as well as intensified the contradictions of capitalist development in other countries, especially East Asia. This perspective makes clear that China's foreign investment driven export-led growth cannot be treated as simply a positive some experience replicable by other nations. We conclude by first summarizing the main lessons of our work, highlighting the continuing relevance of Marxist theory and the importance of building movements for change based on principles of international solidarity and through engagement with worker community struggles against capitalist imperatives. We then outlined an alternative, a worker community-centered approach to socialist developments that treats export and foreign investment as vehicles of grassroots needs and capabilities of international solidarity. Okay,